The gunshot that split the morning air wasn't what brought Yates Jennings running from his barn. It was the sudden cessation of humming that had been drifting through his vegetable garden for the past 20 minutes that made his heart skip. He'd been alone on his ranch outside Wyatt, Colorado for 3 years now, ever since his father passed and his mother moved back east to live with her sister. And in all that time, he'd never once heard a woman's voice on his property, let alone such a sweet, melodic sound that seemed to make even his struggling tomato plant stand a little straighter in the late spring of 1876. When he rounded the corner of the barn, rifle in hand but pointed safely at the ground, he stopped dead in his tracks. There in the middle of his garden, kneeling between rows of half-wilted lettuce and surprisingly robust carrots, was a young woman in a faded blue dress that had seen better days. Her dark hair hung in a long braid down her back, and she was frozen in place, her hands hovering over a basket that was half filled with vegetables she'd apparently been harvesting from his garden without permission. What struck him most wasn't the fact that she was stealing from him, or that she'd been trespassing. It was the way her eyes, wide and startled and the color of honey in sunlight, seemed to hold both fear and defiance in equal measure. "Don't shoot," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious trembling in her hands. "I wasn't trying to cause trouble. I've been walking for 2 days and I'm hungry." Yates lowered his rifle completely, suddenly aware of how threatening he must look. He was a tall man, over 6 feet, with broad shoulders built from years of ranch work, and he knew his face, weathered and lined despite only being 25 years old, could look intimidating when he wasn't smiling. "I wasn't going to shoot you. That gunshot wasn't me. Probably someone hunting on the far side of my property line." She stood slowly, and he could see now that she was young, probably around 20 or so, and desperately thin beneath that worn dress. Her boots were barely holding together, the leather cracked and splitting at the seams. "I'm sorry for taking your vegetables. I can work to pay you back if you want. I'm good with animals and I can cook and clean and mend things." "What's your name?" he asked, setting his rifle against the fence post to show he meant no harm. "Zara Osborne," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "I've been traveling from Kansas. My family died last winter of fever, all of them within a week of each other. I was staying with neighbors afterward, but their son wanted to marry me and I didn't want to marry him, so I left." Yates felt something twist in his chest at the matter-of-fact way she stated such tragedy. "You walked all the way from Kansas, got rides on wagons here and there, worked for food when I could. A family brought me most of the way to Denver, but the wife got jealous because the husband kept looking at me wrong, so she made him leave me at a crossroads 3 days back. I've been walking since then." Zara gestured at the basket. "Like I said, I'll work to pay for what I took." He looked at the basket, then at his garden, which had been gradually dying because he simply didn't have the time or inclination to tend it properly, while managing everything else on the ranch. The truth was, he'd been living on salt pork and beans for weeks because he couldn't bring himself to care about cooking proper meals for just himself. "You can keep what's in the basket, and if you want, there's more you can take." "I don't take charity," Zara said firmly. "Not charity." "You said you're good with animals and can cook." When she nodded, he continued, "I've got a ranch to run by myself, and it's more than one man can handle properly. My garden is dying, my house is a mess, and I've got 3 horses that need better care than I can give them while managing the cattle. If you want work, I've got work. Room and board plus wages if you're serious about staying." She studied him with those honey-colored eyes, clearly trying to determine if he was the kind of man who would take advantage of a woman in a desperate situation. He stood still and let her look, knowing that whatever she saw would have to be enough to convince her, because he'd never been good with words and he wasn't about to start making promises he couldn't keep. "Just work?" she asked finally. "Just work," he confirmed. "There's a room off the kitchen that my mother used to use for sewing and such. It's got a good lock on the door. You can stay there." Something in her posture relaxed slightly. "All right, I'll work for you, Mr. Jennings. How did you know my name?" "Mailbox at the end of your drive," she said with the slightest hint of a smile. Yates Jennings was painted clear as day. He found himself almost smiling back, which was unusual because he hadn't had much cause to smile in longer than he could remember. "Well then, Zara Osborne, let me show you to the house and we can figure out arrangements." As they walked back toward the two-story ranch house his father had built 20 years ago, Yates noticed that she started humming again, the same tune he'd heard drifting through the garden earlier. It was something old and gentle, maybe a hymn or a folk song, and it seemed to fill the air around them with something he couldn't quite name, but that made his chest feel less tight than it had in years. The house was exactly as she'd probably expected, he thought, watching her take in the dusty furniture, the dishes piled in the sink, the general air of neglect that came from a man living alone with no reason to keep things nice. To her credit, Zara didn't say anything judgmental, just set her basket on the kitchen table and looked at him expectantly. "The room is through there," he said, pointing to a door on the far side of the kitchen. "It's small, but it's got a window and a decent bed. The lock works from the inside." She went to investigate and he heard the door open and close, heard her testing the lock. When she came back out, she was nodding. "This will do fine. What do you want me to start with? You said you haven't eaten properly in days. Maybe start by making us both some lunch." "I've got supplies, just haven't been using them much. Then if you're not too tired, the garden could use proper attention and the horses definitely need tending." "I can do all that," Zara said, already moving toward the pantry. "Do you have bread? Eggs? I could make something quick." Within 30 minutes, she'd somehow transformed his sparse ingredients into a meal that made his stomach growl with anticipation. Fried eggs with wild onions she'd found growing near his well, bread toasted over the stove with butter, and coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of the bitter mud he usually made for himself. They sat at opposite ends of his kitchen table and ate in comfortable silence, or at least it was comfortable for him. He kept sneaking glances at her, watching the way she ate delicately but efficiently, like someone who'd learned not to waste anything. "This is good," he said, because it seemed like something he should acknowledge. "It's just eggs and toast," she replied, but he could see the pleased flush in her cheeks. "I haven't had eggs cooked this well in 3 years." She looked up at him then, really looked at him, and he felt suddenly self-conscious under her gaze. "You've been alone here all that time, more or less. Got neighbors about 5 miles east, the Richardsons. They check on me sometimes, but mostly everyone keeps to themselves out here. Town is about 8 miles south if you need anything you can't get on the ranch. And you've been managing all this by yourself," he shrugged. "Managing might be a strong word. Surviving is more accurate." That made her smile, a real smile this time that transformed her whole face and made him realize she was actually quite pretty when she wasn't scared or defensive. "Well then, maybe we can both do better than just surviving." After lunch, Zara insisted on doing the dishes while he went back to the work he'd been doing before he heard her in the garden. He was repairing a section of fence in the north pasture, hard work under the climbing sun that left him sweating and sore. But every time he paused to wipe his brow or take a drink from his canteen, he could hear that humming drifting across the distance, and it made the work somehow more bearable. By the time he returned to the house as the sun was starting its descent toward the mountains, He found the kitchen clean, the dishes put away, and something that smelled absolutely incredible simmering on the stove. Zara was outside near the barn, and when he went to find her, he discovered her brushing down his bay mare with long, gentle strokes while singing softly to the horse. "She likes you," he said from the doorway, making her jump slightly. "Sorry, I didn't hear you come up. I hope it's all right that I'm brushing her. I finished with the garden and thought the horses might appreciate some attention. It's more than all right. I've been neglecting them shamefully." He moved closer, watching the way his typically skittish mare stood calmly under Zara's hands. "She doesn't usually take to strangers. Animals can tell when someone means them well," Zara said simply. "What's her name?" "Cinnamon. The other two are Ranger and Buck." She continued brushing as she talked. "Ranger is the big black gelding and Buck is the chestnut. I brushed them both already. They all needed their hooves cleaned too, so I did that. Hope that was all right." Yates felt something warm spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the day's heat. "You didn't have to do all that your first day. I said I'd work for my keep. I meant it." She finished with Cinnamon and gave the mare a final pat before hanging the brush on its hook. "There's stew for dinner. Nothing fancy, just what I could find in your pantry, but it should be ready whenever you're hungry." That first evening set a pattern that continued through the following weeks. Yates would wake before dawn to find Zara already in the kitchen, humming as she prepared breakfast. She'd pack him food to take with him if he was going to be working far from the house, and when he returned, there would be fresh water for washing up and dinner ready or nearly so. The house gradually transformed from the dusty, neglected bachelor quarters. It had been into something that felt almost like a home again. But more than the physical changes, it was the sound that changed everything for Yates. Zara seemed to hum or sing almost constantly as she worked. Old folk songs and hymns and melodies he didn't recognize. The silence that had been his constant companion for 3 years was replaced by this gentle, persistent music that seeped into every corner of the ranch. And he was beginning to realize every corner of his heart. He found himself making excuses to work closer to wherever she was, just so he could hear her better. When she was hanging laundry, he'd suddenly remember something that needed fixing on that side of the house. When she was in the garden, he'd decide that particular fence line needed checking. He told himself he was just making sure she was safe, that she wasn't overdoing it. But the truth was becoming harder to ignore. 3 weeks after she arrived, they had their first real conversation beyond simple logistics. It was a Sunday, and he declared it a day of rest, which meant lighter work rather than none at all since animals still needed tending regardless of the calendar. They'd finished the necessary chores by mid-morning and found themselves sitting on the porch together, drinking cool water and watching clouds build over the mountains. "You miss them?" Zara asked suddenly. "Your parents?" Yates considered the question. "My father, yes, every day. My mother, I miss what we had before my father died, but after he passed, she was so consumed by grief that she wasn't really herself anymore. When she left for her sister's place back in Pennsylvania, it was almost a relief. Does that make me a terrible son?" "No," Zara said softly. "It makes you honest. I miss my family terribly, but I also remember all the complicated parts. My father drank too much, especially after bad harvests. My mother was bitter about how her life had turned out. My brother was kind but weak, never stood up to our father. But they were still my family, and losing them all at once felt like the world ended." "How did you keep going?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the horizon. "I'm not sure I had a choice. You either keep going or you lie down and die, and I wasn't ready to die. So I got up each morning and did what needed doing, and eventually the days started feeling less like torture and more like just days. That's when the neighbor's son wanted to marry you. He proposed 2 months after I buried my family. Said I needed a man to take care of me, that it was the practical thing to do. And maybe it was practical, but I couldn't stand the thought of marrying someone I didn't love just because I was scared of being alone. She turned to look at him. Have you ever been in love? The question caught him off guard. I don't think so. Thought I was once when I was 19. There was a girl in town, Sarah Mitchell. She was pretty and laughed at my jokes, and I thought maybe we'd get married someday. Then she met a traveling salesman who promised her a life in San Francisco, and she left without even saying goodbye. That must have hurt. It did at the time. But looking back, I think my pride was hurt more than my heart. I didn't really know her, not properly. We just danced at a few socials and talked about surface things. He paused, then added, What about you? No. I thought about love the way young girls do, all romantic notions from books and stories. But real life on a struggling farm in Kansas didn't leave much room for romance. The boys I knew were either too rough or too boring, and none of them ever made my heart feel anything particular. What would make your heart feel something particular? He asked before he could stop himself. She smiled slightly. I'm not entirely sure. Kindness, I think. Intelligence. Someone who sees me as a person, and not just a pair of hands to help with work or a body to warm a bed. Someone who doesn't mind my humming. Your humming is the best part of my day, he said, the words coming out before he could consider whether they were too revealing. Zara turned to look at him fully, her honey-colored eyes wide with surprise. Really? The ranch was so quiet before you came. I didn't realize how much the silence was weighing on me until I didn't have it anymore. Now, when you're humming, everything feels lighter somehow. The work doesn't seem as hard. The days don't feel as long. He stopped, feeling heat creep up his neck. I'm not saying this right. I think you're saying it perfectly, she said softly, and there was something in her expression that made his heart beat faster. They sat there on the porch for a while longer, not talking, but the silence between them was different now, charged with possibility and awareness. When Zara eventually went inside to start preparing their midday meal, she was humming again, but Yates thought maybe there was a new brightness to the sound. As spring turned toward summer, the ranch flourished in ways it hadn't since before his father's death. The garden produced more vegetables than they could eat, so Zara started preserving and pickling. The horses were healthier and better trained. Even the cattle seemed calmer, though Yates suspected that was more about his own improved mood affecting how he handled them than any direct influence from Zara. They fell into an easy rhythm of working together. Zara proved to be more capable than he'd initially given her credit for. She could ride well enough to help him move cattle between pastures, could handle a gun competently when predators threatened the livestock, and had a natural instinct for which animals were sick or injured before the symptoms became obvious. More than once, her early intervention saved him time, money, and heartache. But it was the small moments that accumulated into something larger, something that Yates found himself unable and unwilling to deny. The way Zara would bring him water when he was working in the heat, staying to talk for a few minutes about nothing in particular. The way she'd started sitting beside him at meals rather than across from him, close enough that their arms would occasionally brush. The way she'd begun to sing rather than just hum, her voice filling the house with ballads and love songs that made him ache with longing. One evening in late June, after a particularly long day of branding calves, they were both exhausted and filthy. Zara had insisted on helping despite the difficult, dirty work, and she'd proven herself as capable as any ranch hand he'd ever worked with. They'd washed up at the pump outside and were sitting on the porch steps, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "I got a letter from my mother today," Yates said. "The mail came while we were working the north pasture." "Is she well?" Zara asked. "She's well enough. Says she's settled in with my aunt and doesn't plan on coming back to Colorado. She wants to know if I'd be willing to sell the ranch and join her in Pennsylvania." He felt rather than saw Zara stiffen beside him. "Would you?" "No," he said firmly. "This is my home. My father built this place from nothing, and I'm not going to abandon it. Besides, I have reasons to stay now that I didn't have before." "The ranch is doing well," Zara said carefully. "That's not the only reason." He turned to look at her, his heart pounding. "Zara, I need to tell you something, and I'm going to say it badly because I'm not good with words, but I need to say it anyway." She met his gaze, her expression open and waiting. "When you arrived 2 months ago, I'd been alone so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to look forward to anything. Each day was just something to get through. But you changed that. Not just because you help with the work, though you do and I'm grateful for it. It's you. The way you hum while you work, the way you talk to the horses, the way you smile when you've figured out something that was puzzling you, the way you make everything feel possible again." He took a breath. "I think I'm falling in love with you." "No, that's not right. I think I've already fallen." Zara's eyes were bright, and he couldn't tell if it was from happiness or if she was about to cry and tell him she didn't feel the same way. The seconds stretched out painfully until finally she spoke. "I was so scared that first day," she said quietly. "Scared you'd hurt me or throw me out or worse. But then you were kind, and you gave me work and a safe place to stay, and you never once made me feel like I owed you anything beyond honest labor. And slowly, day by day, I started to feel something I'd never felt before. Every morning I'd wake up excited to start the day because I'd get to see you. Every time you'd come back to the house, my heart would do this strange flutter. When you smile, which you've been doing more of lately, it feels like the sun coming out after rain." "Zara," he said, hardly daring to hope. "I love you too," she said simply. "I think I have for weeks now, but I was afraid to say anything because what if you didn't feel the same way? What if I'd misread everything and you just saw me as an employee?" Yates reached out and took her hand, calloused from work but still somehow soft. "I could never just see you as an employee. You're the reason I want to get up in the morning. You're the reason I want to make this ranch successful. You're the reason I never want there to be silence again." She squeezed his hand, and then she was leaning toward him and he was leaning toward her, and when their lips met, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The kiss was gentle and sweet and perfect, and when they pulled apart they were both smiling. "So what happens now?" Zara asked. "Now we figure out what comes next together," Yates said. "If you want to, that is." "I want to," she said firmly. "I definitely want to." They sat on those porch steps as the stars came out, holding hands and talking about the future in a way that Yates had never imagined being able to do. They talked about expanding the ranch, about maybe getting some sheep to go along with the cattle. They talked about fixing up the house properly, maybe adding on another room or two. They talked carefully around the subject of marriage, both of them aware that it was too soon to make such declarations, but both of them also knowing that was the direction they were heading. The next few weeks were a kind of heaven that Yates had never known existed. Nothing outwardly changed in terms of their work or their living arrangements. Zara still slept in her room off the kitchen with the lock on the door, but everything felt different now. They'd steal moments together throughout the day. A quick kiss behind the barn, holding hands while walking back from checking on the cattle, sitting close together after dinner while they planned the next day's work. Zara's humming took on new dimensions, love songs that made Yates's heart swell, playful tunes that made him laugh, gentle melodies in the evening that soothed away the day's aches and worries. He found himself humming along sometimes, his rough, unpracticed voice joining hers, and she'd smile at him with such joy that he'd forget whatever he was supposed to be doing. They made their first trip into town together in mid-July, needing supplies and also wanting to establish Zara's presence in Wyatt properly. The town was small, maybe 200 people on a busy day, with a general store, a saloon, a church, a blacksmith, and not much else. Yates had kept mostly to himself since his father died, so there was considerable interest when he showed up with a young woman. Yates Jennings, as I live and breathe, Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife, said as they entered the general store. And who might this be? This is Zara Osborne, Yates said, feeling protective as several other customers turned to stare. She's been helping me run the ranch. Helping run the ranch, Mrs. Henderson repeated with raised eyebrows. Is that what we're calling it these days? Zara spoke up before Yates could get defensive. Mr. Jennings was kind enough to give me work when I needed it most. The ranch has been doing very well since we started working together. I'm sure it has, one of the other women said with a tone that suggested she meant something entirely different. Yates felt his jaw tighten, but Zara placed a gentle hand on his arm. We need flour, sugar, coffee, and some fabric if you have any in a nice sturdy cotton. Also salt and baking powder. Mrs. Henderson clearly wanted to pry more, but her husband called from the back of the store, Emma, leave the young people alone and help me with this inventory. As they gathered their supplies, Yates noticed Zara looking at a bolt of fabric in a pretty shade of green. Do you like that one? He asked. It's lovely, but I don't need anything fancy. The sturdy cotton will do for work dresses. What if it's not for a work dress? He said, pulling out the bolt. What if it's for a dress for going to church or for social occasions? Yates, that's expensive fabric. I can afford it. Besides, you've been wearing the same 2 dresses since you arrived. You deserve something nice. He added the green fabric to their pile, along with matching thread and buttons before she could protest further. On the way out of town, they passed the church just as Reverend Phillips was coming out. The Reverend was a kind man in his 50s who'd presided over Yates's father's funeral. Yates, good to see you. It's been too long since you've been to services. I know, Reverend. I've been meaning to come, just been busy with the ranch. Reverend Phillips looked at Zara with friendly curiosity. And who is this? Zara Osborne. She's been helping me with the ranch. Wonderful to meet you, Miss Osborne. Will we be seeing you both at services on Sunday? Yates looked at Zara, who nodded. Yes, Reverend, we'll be there. As they drove the wagon back to the ranch, Zara was quiet. Everyone thinks I'm your mistress, she finally said. Does that bother you? Only because it's not true and it's insulting to both of us. But I suppose people will think what they want to think. Yates pulled the wagon to a stop on a hill overlooking his property. Then let's give them something else to think about. Zara Osborne, I know we've only known each other for 3 months and some might say that's too soon, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me? Zara's eyes went wide. Yates, are you serious? Completely serious. I don't have a ring yet. I should have planned this better. But I can't stand the thought of people disrespecting you because of assumptions they're making about us. More than that, I can't stand the thought of going another day without knowing you're going to be mine forever. Yes, she said, tears streaming down her face now. Yes, of course I'll marry you. He kissed her there on the hill with his ranch spread out below them and the mountains rising up behind them, and it felt like a promise of all the good things to come. They were married 3 weeks later in Reverend Phillips's church with about 30 people in attendance. mostly neighbors and townsfolk who were curious about the quick courtship. Zara wore a dress made from the green fabric Yates had bought her, which she'd sewn herself in the evenings, and she carried wildflowers that Yates had picked that morning. He wore his best suit, which had needed some alteration since he'd lost weight during his years alone, but Zara had fixed it for him. The ceremony was simple and traditional. When Reverend Phillips pronounced them husband and wife and told Yates he could kiss his bride, the kiss they shared was chaste but full of promise. At the small reception afterward in the church hall, Zara sang for the guests, her clear voice filling the space with a love ballad that left more than one person wiping their eyes. "She's a treasure, Mrs. Richardson," one of their nearest neighbors, told Yates while Zara was talking with some of the other women. "You're a lucky man." "I know," Yates said, unable to take his eyes off his wife. That night, when they returned to the ranch as husband and wife, everything was the same and yet completely different. Zara moved her few belongings from the small room off the kitchen to the main bedroom upstairs. And as the sun set, they came together with tenderness and passion, learning each other in the way of newlyweds, awkward and eager and ultimately deeply satisfying. Afterward, as they lay tangled in the sheets with the windows open to let in the cool night air, Zara hummed softly, and Yates realized that this exact moment, was what happiness felt like. Not the absence of problems or struggles, because ranch life would always have those, but the presence of someone who made every struggle worth fighting through. "What are you thinking about?" Zara asked, tracing patterns on his chest. "That I'm the luckiest man in Colorado." "Maybe in the whole country," she laughed softly. "I think I might be the lucky one. When I was walking toward your ranch 3 months ago, hungry and scared and completely lost, I never imagined I'd end up here. Humming in my garden," he said with a smile. "Is that when you first noticed me?" "I heard you before I saw you. You were humming and I couldn't figure out what the sound was because I'd been alone for so long. Then I came around the barn and there you were, and something in my chest just knew." "Knew what?" "That my life was about to change in the best possible way." She kissed him then, and the conversation ended in favor of other activities. But later, as she drifted off to sleep in his arms, she started humming again, some gentle lullaby that made him feel safe and content in a way he'd never experienced before. The rest of that first summer as a married couple was busy and productive. They worked from dawn until dusk most days, but it never felt like a burden because they were working together toward a shared future. The garden flourished under Zara's care, producing so much that they were able to sell excess vegetables in town. The cattle were healthy and multiplying. They'd even acquired a small flock of chickens, which Zara tended with the same care she gave everything else. In September, they had their first real disagreement. It wasn't about anything major, just a difference of opinion about whether they should invest in more cattle or save the money for building improvements. Yates wanted the cattle, seeing it as a way to expand their income. Zara wanted the building improvements, pointing out that the barn roof was starting to leak and winter was coming. "We can patch the barn roof," Yates argued, "but if we don't buy the cattle now, we'll miss the opportunity. And if the barn roof collapses under heavy snow, we could lose animals anyway," Zara countered. "Why risk that?" They went back and forth for most of an evening, both of them getting frustrated, until finally, Yates said something sharp about how he'd been running the ranch before she arrived and knew what he was doing. The moment the words left his mouth, he regretted them, especially when he saw the hurt flash across Zara's face. "You're right," she said quietly. "It's your ranch. You should make the decisions." She stood up from the table and went outside, leaving him sitting there feeling like the worst kind of fool. He found her by the corral, leaning on the fence and staring out at the darkening landscape. "Zara, I'm sorry. That was unfair and untrue. This is our ranch now, not just mine." "We're partners, are we?" she asked without looking at him. "Because it sounded like you think I'm just the help who happens to share your bed." "That's not what I think at all. I was being stubborn and stupid because I don't like being wrong, but you are right. The barn roof is more important than more cattle. We can get the cattle next year." She turned to face him. "I'm not trying to tell you how to run your ranch, Yates. I just want us to make decisions together." "Our ranch," he corrected. "And you're absolutely right. I'm sorry. I promise I'll do better about discussing things instead of just deciding." She studied his face in the dim light, then nodded slowly. "And I promise I'll try to understand that this is all new for you too. You've been making decisions alone for 3 years. It's going to take time to adjust to having a partner." "I do love you," he said earnestly. "More than I can properly express. I know, I love you too, even when you're being stubborn." She managed a small smile. "Especially when you're willing to admit you're wrong." They fixed the barn roof the next week, and Yates had to admit that Zara had been right. There were several places where the wood was rotting and would never have survived a heavy snow load. It cost more than he'd anticipated to do the repairs properly, but when winter came, the barn stayed dry and secure, and he was grateful they'd listened to his wife's wisdom. As autumn progressed, and the leaves turned gold and red in the scattered trees around the property, they settled into their marriage with increasing comfort. They learned each other's rhythms and habits, learned when to push and when to let things go, learned how to fight fair and make up better. Through it all, Zara continued to fill their home with music, and Yates found himself joining in more often, his voice getting stronger and surer as he grew less self-conscious about singing. The first snow came in late October, earlier than usual. They woke to find the world transformed into white silence, beautiful but also concerning since they hadn't finished all their winter preparations. They spent the next week in a frenzy of activity, making sure the animals were secure, that they had enough hay and feed stored, that the house was properly insulated against the cold. When everything was finally ready, and another snow was falling outside, they spent a rare afternoon inside by the fire, Zara mending clothes while Yates worked on fixing some tack that had been damaged. The only sounds were the crackling fire, the wind outside, and Zara's soft humming. "Do you ever miss Kansas?" Yates asked suddenly. Zara looked up from her mending. "I miss the people I loved who are buried there, but the place itself, no. There's nothing left there for me. This is home now." "I'm glad," he said simply. "Do you ever regret that I showed up in your garden that day?" "Never. Not for a single second. You're the best thing that ever happened to me." She set down her mending and came to sit beside him. "Even though I eat your vegetables without permission." "Especially because of that," he said with a grin, pulling her close. "Best theft that ever occurred on this ranch." Winter that year was hard, with more snow than usual and temperatures that plunged low enough to freeze water solid in minutes. They spent most days just keeping the animals alive and the house warm, but even in the midst of the struggle, Yates found himself happier than he'd ever been. There was something deeply satisfying about facing challenges with someone beside you, someone who worked just as hard and never complained about the difficulties. On Christmas morning, they exchanged simple gifts. Yates had commissioned a silver locket in town, which he filled with a small sketch of the ranch that he'd drawn himself, not particularly skillfully, but with love. Zara had knitted him a thick scarf in deep blue wool and made him a new shirt from fabric she'd bought on one of their trips to town, keeping it hidden and working on it only when he was outside. "It's beautiful," he said, running his fingers over the careful stitches. "When did you find time to make this?" "I've been getting up a little earlier," she admitted. "I wanted it to be a surprise. And the scarf, too. Zara, this must have taken weeks. I like making things for you. It makes me happy." He fastened the locket around her neck, the silver bright against her skin. "I wasn't sure what to get you. You never seem to want anything." "That's because I already have everything I need," she said, touching the locket gently. "But this is perfect. I'll treasure it always." They spent the rest of Christmas Day inside, cooking a special meal of roasted chicken with vegetables from their preserved stores, and singing carols together. Zara taught Yates harmonies to songs he'd only ever sung the melody to, and their voices blended in a way that surprised them both. "We sound good together," Zara said with delight. "We do everything good together," Yates replied, and then he was kissing her and dinner was temporarily forgotten. As winter slowly released its grip and spring began to emerge in March of 1877, they discovered that Zara was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but hadn't said anything until she was certain. When she told Yates one evening after supper, he was so shocked and happy that he couldn't speak for a moment, just stared at her with his mouth open. "Say something," she said nervously. "We're going to have a baby," he finally managed. "Are you happy about it?" "Happy." He laughed and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around until she squealed with laughter. "I'm more than happy. I'm overjoyed. I'm terrified. I'm everything." "I'm terrified too," she admitted once he'd set her down. "I don't know the first thing about being a mother. And I don't know anything about being a father, but we'll figure it out together, just like we've figured out everything else." The pregnancy changed things in subtle ways. Zara couldn't do as much heavy work, which frustrated her to no end. But Yates insisted she take it easier. He hired a young man from town, a boy of 16 named Peter who needed work to help his family, to help with the heavy labor around the ranch. This freed Zara to focus on lighter tasks and preparing for the baby's arrival. She started sewing baby clothes in the evenings, tiny gowns and blankets that looked impossibly small. They prepared the second bedroom upstairs, the one that had been Yates's childhood room, repairing the furniture that was still stored there and making sure everything was clean and ready. As Zara's belly grew through the summer, Yates found himself overwhelmed with protective instincts he hadn't known he possessed. He worried constantly about her health, about whether they'd be able to get the doctor from town quickly enough when her time came, about whether he'd be a good father. Zara, for her part, seemed to glow with health and happiness, and her humming took on a quality that seemed to directly address the baby, as if she was already singing to the child. On a warm day in early October, almost exactly a year and a half after Zara had first appeared in his garden, she went into labor. Yates sent Peter racing to town to fetch Dr. Morrison while he stayed with Zara, holding her hand and feeling utterly helpless as she worked through the contractions. "You're doing great," he said, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth. "You don't know that," she panted. "You've never seen someone give birth before." "True, but I know you, and if anyone can do this, it's you." The labor lasted through the afternoon and into the evening. Dr. Morrison arrived and took over with calm efficiency, and Yates was relegated to pacing in the hallway outside their bedroom, listening to Zara's cries and feeling each one like a knife to his heart. Finally, just as full darkness fell, he heard a new sound that made everything else disappear, the strong, angry cry of a newborn baby. Dr. Morrison opened the door with a smile. "Congratulations, Mr. Jennings. You have a healthy son." Yates pushed past him into the room where Zara lay exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she'd made. "Come meet your son," she said softly. He approached almost reverently, looking down at the red, wrinkled face of his child, and felt his heart expand in a way he hadn't known was possible. "He's perfect," he whispered. "He has your nose," Zara said. "Poor kid." But he was grinning through tears he didn't bother to hide. They named him Thomas Edward Jennings, Thomas after Yates's father and Edward after Zara's brother. From the moment he entered the world, Tommy, as they quickly began calling him, was a force to be reckoned with. He had a strong voice and wasn't shy about using it, but he also had moments of quiet contentment, especially when Zara would hum to him. Watching Zara with their son filled Yates with an emotion so profound, he sometimes had trouble breathing. She was a natural mother, patient and loving even when Tommy was fussy and difficult. And Tommy responded to her voice in a way that was almost magical, calming immediately when she would sing or hum, his tiny face turning toward her like a flower toward the sun. Life with a baby was exhausting and chaotic in ways Yates had never anticipated. The carefully organized rhythms they'd established over the past year and a half were completely disrupted. Sleep became a precious commodity, grabbed in short bursts between feedings and changings. The housework that Zara had always kept up with fell behind, and Yates found himself doing more cooking and cleaning than he ever had before. But despite the exhaustion, despite the challenges, Yates had never been happier. Coming in from working the ranch to find Zara nursing Tommy in the rocking chair he'd made for her, humming softly while their son fed, felt like witnessing something holy. Playing with Tommy in the evenings, watching him start to smile and track faces, made every difficult day worthwhile. As Tommy grew through his first winter, and into the spring of 1878, he developed a personality that was equal parts both his parents. He had Yates's determination and stubbornness, refusing to give up when trying to grasp a toy or roll over, but he also had Zara's musical nature, cooing and babbling in ways that almost seemed melodic. "He's going to be a singer like his mother," Yates said one evening, watching as Tommy responded enthusiastically to Zara's singing. "Or maybe he'll be strong and capable like his father," Zara countered. "Why not both?" As it turned out, Tommy would be both and more. But in those early days, they were just happy to watch him grow and change, to marvel at each new development, to fall more deeply in love with him and with each other every day. The ranch continued to prosper. With Peter's help, Yates was able to expand their cattle operation and make significant improvements to the property. They built a new, larger barn and expanded the house, adding a proper dining room and a second-floor bedroom for when Tommy got older. The garden flourished under Zara's care, even as she balanced caring for a baby with all her other responsibilities. They made regular trips to town, where Tommy became something of a favorite among the shopkeepers and townspeople. Even Mrs. Henderson, who had been so suspicious of Zara at first, became a doting pseudo-grandmother, always having a sweet or a small toy for Tommy when they came to the store. On a warm afternoon in June, when Tommy was 8 months old, Yates and Zara were in the garden together. Tommy was sitting on a blanket nearby, gnawing on a wooden toy Yates had carved for him. Zara was humming as she weeded, the same tune Yates had heard that first day, and suddenly he was overwhelmed with the need to tell her something. "Zara, stop for a minute." She looked up, concerned by his tone. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Everything is so right that it almost scares me." He moved to sit beside her on the ground, not caring about the dirt. 2 years ago, I was alone and miserable and just going through the motions of living. I'd forgotten what it felt like to want anything beyond just surviving another day. And then you appeared in my garden, this beautiful, stubborn woman who was humming like she didn't have a care in the world even though you'd lost everything. "Yates," she said softly, touching his face. You brought music back into my life. Not just actual music, though that too, but joy and purpose and hope. You made me want to build something instead of just maintain something. You made me want silence to end, not because silence is bad, but because your voice is so much better. He took her hand. I know I tell you I love you all the time, but I need you to understand how much. You saved me, Zara. You and Tommy saved me from a life that wasn't really living. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. You saved me too. When I was walking toward your ranch that day, I was so lost and scared. I thought I'd never feel safe again, never feel like I belonged anywhere. But you gave me a home and a family and a life I never dared dream about. Every time I hum or sing, it's because I'm so happy I can't contain it. It just spills out of me. Tommy chose that moment to make a loud, demanding sound, and they both laughed through their tears. Someone wants attention, Yates said, reaching over to pick up their son. Tommy immediately grabbed at his father's face with sticky hands, babbling cheerfully. He's going to be talking soon, Zara said, wiping her eyes. Probably trying to tell us to stop being so emotional and pay attention to him. He's his mother's son. Always has to be the center of attention. Excuse me, but which one of us insisted on giving a speech in the middle of weeding? They grinned at each other, and then Yates leaned over and kissed her, gentle and sweet, while Tommy squirmed between them, seeming to approve of his parents' affection. That evening, after they'd put Tommy to bed and were sitting on the porch together in the gathering dusk, Zara said, I think I might be pregnant again. Yates turned to her with wide eyes. Really? I'm not certain yet, but I think so. Are you happy about it? Are you? I asked you first. He pulled her close. I'm happy about anything that involves building our family. If you're pregnant, that's wonderful. If you're not, that's fine too. I'm just happy to be here with you. Good answer, she said with a smile, but I'm pretty sure I am. Which means we'll have 2 babies by next spring. She was right. In late February of 1879, Zara gave birth to their second son, whom they named James Peter Jennings. James, after no one in particular, but because they both liked the name, and Peter after the young man who'd become almost like family to them in his time working on the ranch. Having 2 children under the age of 2 was exponentially harder than having just one. Tommy was at the age where he was into everything, curious and mobile, and requiring constant supervision. James was a colicky baby who cried more than Tommy ever had, and there were many nights when Yates and Zara took turns walking him around the house, trying to soothe him while also making sure Tommy stayed asleep. But they managed, working together with the same partnership that had gotten them through every other challenge. Yates took on even more of the household duties, becoming surprisingly competent at cooking and cleaning. Zara, despite her exhaustion, maintained her patient good humor, humming to both boys even when she was clearly at the end of her rope. Peter, who was now 19 and had become an invaluable part of the ranch operation, stepped up to handle more responsibilities, allowing Yates to spend more time helping with the children. The young man had grown into a capable ranch hand, and Yates had started paying him a full wage rather than the partial wage he'd started with. You're going to want your own place someday, Yates told him one day while they were mending fence. Maybe, Peter said, but I'm in no hurry. I like it here. You and Mrs. Jennings have been good to me, better than I deserved when I was just a green kid who barely knew which end of a hammer to hold. You've more than earned your keep, and if you ever want to buy some land and start your own ranch, I'll help however I can. As the boys grew, the house was filled with noise and chaos and laughter. Tommy started talking in complete sentences by age 2, and he had inherited his mother's love of singing, making up elaborate songs about everything he did. James was quieter but more thoughtful, watching everything carefully with his father's serious gray eyes. Yates often thought back to those silent days before Zara arrived, and he literally couldn't imagine going back to that existence. The house was never quiet now, between the boys playing and arguing, Zara singing while she worked, and his own voice joining in more often than not. It was beautiful chaos, and he wouldn't trade it for anything. In the summer of 1881, when Tommy was approaching 4 and James was 2.5, Zara announced that she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was harder on her. She was tired all the time and suffered from nausea well into the second trimester. Yates worried constantly, and they made more frequent trips to see Dr. Morrison just to make sure everything was all right. "She's just tired," the doctor assured Yates. "Having 2 young children and being pregnant is exhausting. Make sure she rests as much as possible." Getting Zara to rest was easier said than done. She was stubborn about keeping up with her responsibilities, insisting she could handle everything. It took Yates putting his foot down, something he rarely did, to get her to accept more help. They hired a woman from town, Mrs. Sullivan, to come 3 days a week to help with the housework and watch the boys so Zara could rest. This pregnancy progressed more slowly than the others, or at least it seemed that way. But finally, in late January of 1882, Zara went into labor. This time, things went much faster than with either of the boys. Dr. Morrison barely made it in time, and within a few hours of the first contractions, they heard the cry of their newest addition. "It's a girl," Dr. Morrison announced with a smile. Tommy and James, who had been staying with the Richardsons during the birth, were brought home to meet their new sister. They named her Rose Margaret Jennings. Rose because Zara had always loved Roses and Margaret after Yates's mother. Rose was different from the boys from the start. She was a calm, happy baby who rarely cried and seemed content to just observe the world around her. She had Zara's honey-colored eyes and what looked like it would be dark hair like her mother's. Tommy was immediately protective of his baby sister, while James seemed a bit uncertain about this new addition to the family. "He'll warm up to her," Zara assured Yates. "He just needs time to adjust." She was right. Within a few weeks, James was as devoted to Rose as Tommy was, and the 3 children formed a tight unit that would last throughout their lives. Life settled into a new rhythm with 3 children. The ranch was more successful than it had ever been, allowing them to hire additional help and make their lives a bit easier. Yates and Zara had grown into their roles as parents, still learning but much more confident than they'd been with Tommy. The house was always filled with music now. Zara sang while she worked, Tommy sang made-up songs at top volume, and even James could be heard humming softly while he played. Rose, as she grew, would coo and babble along with the others, adding her voice to the family choir. Yates, who had once lived in complete silence, now couldn't imagine ever wanting quiet again. On their 5th wedding anniversary in July of 1882, Yates arranged for Mrs. Sullivan to watch the children overnight so he could take Zara on a picnic to the spot where he'd proposed. It was the first time they'd been completely alone together since Rose was born, and the freedom felt both wonderful and strange. "I keep expecting to hear crying or Tommy yelling about something," Zara said with a laugh as they spread out their blanket. "Same. I think I've forgotten what it's like to have a complete conversation without interruptions." They ate the food Zara had prepared, talked about everything and nothing, and watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. As the stars began to appear, Zara started humming that same tune from the first day, and Yates joined in, their voices blending in harmony. "You remember the first time you heard me humming?" Zara asked. "Like it was yesterday." I was in the barn and I heard this sound drifting across the property, and I couldn't figure out what it was at first. Then I came around the corner and saw you kneeling in my garden, stealing my vegetables." He grinned. "Best theft in history. I was so scared when you came up with that rifle. But then you were kind and you gave me a chance and everything changed. Everything changed for me too. The silence was killing me slowly, I think. I just didn't realize it until it was gone and I could breathe again." He pulled her close. "You gave me back my life, Zara. You and the children. I never want to go back to that silence. Never want a day without your humming and the kids singing and all the beautiful noise that means I'm not alone anymore." "You'll never be alone again," she promised. "I'm here, and I'm staying, and we're going to grow old together on this ranch, surrounded by our children and eventually grandchildren, and there will be music always." "Music always," he agreed, and kissed her under the stars. They made love there on the blanket with the mountains watching over them and the sounds of night creatures providing a natural symphony. And it felt like both a renewal of their wedding vows and a celebration of everything they'd built together. The years that followed were good ones. Tommy started school in town when he turned 6, riding in with Yates 3 days a week to attend the small schoolhouse. He was a bright student who loved learning almost as much as he loved singing. James followed 2 years later, more studious and serious than his older brother but equally intelligent. Rose, when her turn came, proved to be something special, reading by age 4 and showing an aptitude for numbers that surprised everyone. The ranch continued to prosper under Yates and Zara's joint management. They'd expanded several times, buying adjacent land as it became available, hiring more help as needed. Peter eventually did strike out on his own, buying a small parcel to the east and starting his own ranch. But he remained close friends with the family and often brought his own children to play with the Jennings kids. In the summer of 1890, Tommy turned 13 and announced he wanted to work the ranch full-time instead of continuing school. Yates and Zara discussed it at length and decided that, while they wanted all their children to be educated, they also understood that ranching was in Tommy's blood. They reached a compromise where he'd continue studying basic subjects with Zara in the evenings while working with Yates during the day. James, on the other hand, showed an interest in medicine after Dr. Morrison let him observe some basic treatments. "I think I might want to be a doctor," he announced at dinner one evening when he was 11. "Then you'll need to stay in school and eventually go to medical college," Yates said. "That's expensive, but we'll figure it out." Rose, at 9 years old, declared she wanted to be a teacher. "Someone has to educate all these ranch children," she said with the authority only a youngest child could muster. Watching their children grow into individuals with their own dreams and ambitions filled Yates with pride and a touch of melancholy. Time was moving so fast, the years slipping by like water through his fingers. But when he'd mention this to Zara, she'd just smile and remind him that this was what they were working toward, raising children who could go out into the world and make their own marks. On a cool evening in October of 1895, Yates was sitting on the porch with Zara, watching the sunset when she said, "Do you remember when I told you I never wanted silence again?" "I said that, actually. But yes." "Well, I was thinking about it today, about how our home is always filled with music and voices and life. Tommy singing while he works, James humming while he studies, Rose practicing piano songs on the instrument you bought her last year. And I realized that we did exactly what we set out to do. We built a home filled with joy instead of silence." "We did," Yates agreed, "though it's going to get quieter when James leaves for medical school next year, and even quieter when Rose goes to the teaching college in Denver after that." And someday Tommy will find a wife and build his own house somewhere on the property. She took his hand. But we'll still have each other, and we'll still have the music we make together. Always, he promised. Tommy did eventually take over most of the ranch operations, becoming a skilled rancher who expanded the business even further. He married at 22, a sweet girl from town named Caroline, and they built a house on the western edge of the property. Their children, when they came, spent as much time at their grandparents' house as their own, drawn by Zara's cookies and songs and Yates's stories and patient teaching. James did become a doctor, graduating from medical college in Chicago and returning to Wyatt to take over for the aging doctor. Morrison. He married a fellow medical student, and though they had no children of their own, they dedicated their lives to caring for others. Rose became a teacher as she dreamed, and though many tried to court her, she remained unmarried by choice, saying she was too busy educating young minds to worry about romance. She lived in town during the school year, but spent summers at the ranch, filling the house with her piano playing and her laughter. As Yates and Zara grew older, their hair graying and their bodies showing the effects of years of hard work, they never lost the essential joy that had characterized their life together. They still sang together in the evenings, their voices not as strong as they once were, but still in harmony. Zara still hummed while she worked, though her work now was more about tending her extensive flower gardens than the heavy labor of earlier years. Yates still found himself stopping to listen, still marveling that this woman had chosen him, that she'd appeared in his garden that day and changed everything. On a warm summer evening in 1910, when they'd been married for 33 years and Yates was 59 and Zara was 53, they were sitting on their porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Tommy and Caroline's 4 children, ranging from age 12 down to 6, were engaged in some elaborate game that involved a lot of running and shrieking. Their voices, high and happy, filled the air with beautiful chaos. "I was thinking today," Zara said, "about that first morning when you found me in your garden. You think about that often, sometimes. I think about how scared I was, how desperate. I was at the absolute lowest point of my life, and then there you were, this kind, lonely man who needed someone just as much as I needed him." "I did need you," Yates said, "more than I knew how to say at the time. And now look at us. 3 children, 9 grandchildren, a successful ranch, a whole life we built from nothing but determination and love. And music," he added. "Don't forget the music," she laughed. "How could I forget the music? It's everywhere. In the house, in the fields, in the voices of our grandchildren. We filled our whole world with music. Because you taught me that silence isn't peace, it's just emptiness. And I never want to be empty again." She took his hand, and they sat there in comfortable silence, though even the silence wasn't really silent because there were children playing, birds singing in the trees, and the wind rustling through the grass, all of it forming a natural symphony that was the soundtrack of their life together. Later that evening, after the grandchildren had gone home and the house was settling for the night, Yates found Zara in their bedroom, brushing her hair at the vanity he'd built for her years ago. He came up behind her and met her eyes in the mirror. "I love you," he said, simple and direct as he'd always been. "I know," she replied with a smile. "I love you too. No, I mean I really love you, not just in a comfortable married way, though I do love you that way. But I'm still in love with you the way I was that first summer when everything was new and terrifying and wonderful. You're still the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Your humming still makes my heart beat faster. I still find excuses to be near you just because being near you makes everything better." She turned on the bench to face him properly, tears shining in her honey-colored eyes. "Yates Jennings, after 33 years of marriage, you can still surprise me. Good. I hope I'm still surprising you when we're 90. I hope we make it to 90. And I hope when we do, I'm still humming and you're still listening, and we're still just as in love as we are right now." "I guarantee it," he said, and pulled her to her feet for a kiss that still held all the passion and promise of their younger years. They lived many more years together, watching their family grow and change, watching the world modernize around them while their ranch remained a constant. They added more rooms to the house to accommodate visiting family, planted more gardens, made more improvements. But the essential nature of their life together never changed. There was always music, always joy, always the deep, abiding love that had started with a woman humming in a garden and a lonely man who discovered he never wanted silence again. When Yates died in 1925 at the age of 74, it was peacefully in his sleep with Zara beside him. She held his hand and sang him into the next world with the same hymns she'd been humming that first day 49 years earlier. She lived another 8 years without him, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren, and every single one of them would later say that not a day went by when she didn't speak of him or hum one of the songs they'd loved together. When she passed in 1933 at the age of 76, the family gathered at the ranch for her funeral. As they lowered her casket into the ground beside Yates's, a strange thing happened. A wind came up, gentle and warm despite it being October, and it seemed to carry the faint sound of humming across the property. The grandchildren looked at each other in wonder, and the great-grandchildren asked what the sound was. "It's Grandma and Grandpa," Rose said with certainty, now a woman of 61 herself. "They're together again, and they're singing." And though such things couldn't be proven or explained, everyone there felt the truth of it in their hearts. The ranch that had once been a place of silence had become a place of eternal music, filled with the love of two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful that would echo through generations. The house still stands today, maintained by the descendants of Yates and Zara Jennings. And if you visit on a quiet evening, if you stand in the garden where it all began, some say you can still hear it, that same gentle humming that changed everything, that turned silence into symphony, that proved love could bloom even in the hardest soil if tended with care and devotion. The humming that saved a lonely cowboy and gave a desperate woman a home, and created a legacy of music and love that would never truly end.